Welcome to Insight, a series exploring the deeper philosophies of renowned traditional martial artists, hosted by Ray Hughes, a martial artist with 50 years of experience.
Hey, welcome to the show. Today is part two of a two-part conversation with Doug Jepperson as he describes his experience, his perceptions, opinions, his insights of his 50 plus years in the martial arts. Thank you for joining the conversation. The thing so I started in the mid 70s in Arizona under Sensei Marlon, my sensei. So I wasn't really exposed to those teachings in Salt Lake at that time. But I do remember where I started getting philosophical, and with Marlon, we both would be those long drives back. We'd drive 12 hours in a car, and we would talk about the philosophies between what we were doing in Arizona and Salt Lake, because Salt Lake seemed to us like just bad guys, and they were out to hurt you. And I remember one of the black belts, I can't think his name. He says, if you're not going to win, get disqualified, that kind of mentality. And we would shake our heads coming back thinking, is this the way it's supposed to be? And the funny thing about that, a lot of those guys had that philosophy, but Osaka never said anything. I never heard him say those kinds of things. Like, I don't know where that mindset of those fighters, that group that you're part of, where that came from.
I can only guess at the circumstances. When Sensei Osaka started, it was 1969 at the local YMCA. By the time I got there, about 72 or so, he already had 4 or 5 people that were his senior students. And it was right about then, I think it was 71 or 72, that Joe Sharon came to the dojo. Every single one of his senior students left when Joe got there. Joe was mulatto, and because he was half black and half white, and he was born before World War II, he was taken from his mother and put in an orphanage. I didn't know that they did that back then. We knew so little about racial identity because Salt Lake's a white town. So
Yeah.
Joe was put into an orphanage. And of course, he found out this story himself. He stayed in this horrible orphanage until he was 13. It was so horrible, he ran away. And when he got to Florida, this would have been in the very early 60s. He took martial arts down there, and then he ended up joining the Navy and getting on their boxing team. And he was discharged dishonorably from the Navy because he beat up his superior. And then Joe just drifted around from school to school. I was surprised. One time he was showing me photographs when he was in Memphis of him and Bill Wallace. And this is before Bill Wallace was famous. And there's pictures. And I says, you know who this is? Bill Wallace. And he says, oh, how about that? And there's stories about when he went down to Texas and trained with Roy Curbin and got upset with Roy and grabbed him by the ponytail and drug him out of the ring. And then when Joe got to Salt Lake, he and Osaka fought like cats and dogs for days. Well, Joe became the meter to which we all marched. Joe raised the bar on violence. And when you asked about Sensei Osaka, by design or not, he allowed it to happen. Sensei
Yeah.
Osaka was certainly drawn to the rougher characters in life. But then he grew up in the streets of Tokyo. His father was gone, and he had to fend for himself any way he could. And so some of that mentality was there. And then Joe, like I say, was just a rough character. 1975, I'll tell you a story. Um, some friends of mine from school, the Malonis twins, I knew them from high school because they wrestled. Well, Milt Malonis turned out to be one of the best fighters Osaka had ever had. Just incredibly talented young man. In 75, we went to the very first combination Western States Championship. Sensei Yaguchi and Sensei Kurobani hosted this, and they had invited, at that time, Sensei Nakayama was alive, and he came and he brought over 3 or 4 college students from Takushoku. Frank Smith came, Masahiko Tanaka came. They had demonstration fights. I mean, it was a massive deal. And remember that Nakayama had brought his top college kids. Well, I don't know if they were top, but they were college fighters, and they entered the tournament, and everybody just assumed they were going to win. Well, lo and behold, Milt Malonis won the entire tournament, and Osaka was so pleased that he has his photograph still. I don't know, of course, he's closed down his dojo, but a photograph of Nakayama giving the tournament to Milt. When they got back to Salt Lake, our classes, I don't know about you, but they were structured like Monday night, we would do basics and fight with hands. Tuesday night, we would do something similar to that. Wednesday night was kata. And remember, we had 5 katas, so we got done with those pretty quick. And did you do the katas like as fast as you humanly could and then you were
Oh,
done?
yeah. Well, the worst thing you could ever do in our organization is to win a kata competition. The big joke is if you ever won a kata competition, you had to wear a pink gi, because we just looked at kata with disdain. And I blame all you guys for that philosophy.
Yeah, they did that. And then Thursday night, we had a kumite night. But after Milt won that tournament, Osaka turned Thursday night over to him and said, "You teach the kumite." Now, mind you, Milt's 23 years old. He did win a big tournament, but he doesn't know how to teach. And so he and his twin brother, I have to say, they were sadistic. They taught that class with even more cruelty. And in fact, there was, and this is not a story, I was there. At that time, we were getting a lot of Iranians coming over because they were coming to Utah to go to the engineering school up at the University of Utah. There was a young man by the name of Abu Fas, and he was probably the lead one of the Persian kids. And he would have been, I don't know, colored belt, maybe brown belt or something like that. And we're doing all the rotations. Well, when he got to Milt and we were supposed to bow, he would not bow. None of us knew anything about Islam. None of us knew anything about the religious feelings. His English was not good. So they tried to explain it and he refused to bow. So, like every problem, he tried to beat him up and drive him out of the dojo. This went on for about a week until finally one night he and his brother beat up Abel so bad his arm broke. Finally, Joe came to Abel's rescue, but Abel got mad at that. I'm probably pronouncing his name wrong, Abul. Anyway, um, and I do want to share one thing. People asked about it, and I said, I don't know that they were any better fighters, but I'll tell you, fear and pain was not something that factored into the way they trained. They didn't care about it. And Abul came over from Iran, and he later on joined up with Khomeini and the freedom fighters. He thought this was how we trained, so he just accepted it as how we trained. But then the rest of the students, there's an example when you watch that and you think, okay, this is the value system that we have. And when you mentioned about getting disqualified instead of winning, that was absolutely my attitude. I was taught that for a long time. Finally, years late, when it's far too late, Hobish got me aside and he said, you could probably win more tournaments if you didn't abandon it so quickly and try to get disqualified.
Mm.
Because there's a lot of tournaments that are won in the last 20 seconds. You get a point or something like that. Yeah, as the way I grew up, and as you know, Ray, we are reluctant to talk about some of these stories because we're a little bit embarrassed about the light that it
Yes.
will shed on us. And there's more stories that I'm not willing to tell on a public broadcast.
No, no, we don't want to do that. But you think about it, I believe across the board of all the traditional martial arts schools in those days, I'm sure there was a harshness that was across the board. Because honestly, the fighting, regardless of what tournament you went to in those days, was brutal. It was really, really brutal. And it's just the way it is. And
Exactly. Yes.
so I think that's made better fighters. But I look back and I feel real bad about how many people quit because of the abuse. So it was really abuse. I never realized a lot of it until I had to take Safe Sport through USA Karate, and it talks about all this type of abuse. And I'm thinking, oh my God, we needed this back in those days. I think it's better. Where do you think martial arts has gone now? Do you think it's weak?
Yes and no. I agree with you on the point about driving people out. Anybody who's taught many years like you and I have seen students, they're just simply not used to a physical confrontation
Right.
and physically hitting people. But as they train, they learn that they're much more courageous than they thought they were, that they're tougher than they thought they were. In our system, they would have been driven out. Whereas with
Yes.
teachers today, and I know you do this, I watch your classes. A lot of the instructors, they teach confidence and how to build that confidence. And then I know that you and I have shared this belief that you bring a student along as quickly as they are capable of
Yes.
psychologically.
Yes.
And
And physical.
and
Physically.
yeah, and like when they're out there free sparring, as soon as I would see one of my students, the weaker one mentally, I could see it was a little bit dangerous. I would stop or rotate the line because I didn't want them to feel that humiliation of I can't do this. And I don't know. In the long run, I think we kept more students. And when I said yes and no, because I am old and I can't give up on it, I do think there was a little bit of mental toughness that we could have today. For example, and I'll get in trouble for this, the bully program that they've implemented in schools, I disagree with completely because when I was growing up, the bully can be very careful. You don't even know that they're uh, picking on somebody. They're subtle, and usually you catch the kid that retaliates, who is not the one who initiated it.
Right. Right.
Um, and you probably remember this, Ray. You'd walk down the hall, and somebody would give you an elbow to the ribs, and this would go on until you would fight back. At least the schools I went to, but where there's absolutely no contact, and I'm confused on this within my own head. I don't think we should have contact, but there's students today that have never ever been punched in the face. They've never ever had any contact. If they don't do a contact sport like football, wrestling, or even basketball, they don't know what it's like to bump into something. And I remember saying to a student, you bump into your kitchen counter harder than that kid just hit you.
Mm.
But there is an emotional response to somebody hitting you. So that part, I think our humans could be toughened up. In fact, you've probably heard the saying that really good times create soft people, really
Yeah.
bad times create tough people.
The interesting thing what you're talking about bullying, and I wrestle with that even today because uh, I was bullied from the fourth, seventh grade, and it was pretty bad. I hated it. It was terrible. But it also made me a man because it made me learn how to deal with conflict, and life is full of conflict. I have met guys that have come into my school acting all tough and they want to join the school, mostly like older guys, and then to find out they had never had to defend themselves once in their life. Their schools were so sanitized that there was no contact, and these guys were really quite insecure because they didn't learn to deal with adversity when they were young and growing up. And how do you control that in a school without it getting a hand? I don't know. But if you keep it so sanitized where there's no conflict, you're going to develop weak people, at least in my opinion.
And I realize you and I are probably going to get categorized as
Yeah,
dinosaurs and
I know it.
shipped off. But then at the same time, I can say this, and I've seen you say this. We were always kind to I mean, the last 15 years, always kind to our students. We always took
Yes.
care of them. We looked out on them. So I know that our values were there, but then on the other side, I am going to agree with you as far as the bullying, and I'm going to quote Mike Tyson, who said he thinks the reason a lot of people are rude today is they've never been punched in the face.
So if you get punched in the face, you won't be rude. Is that what you're saying?
Well, and Ray, even though we grew up in different towns, when I was a young kid, you did not mouth off to older kids. You did not
Right.
mouth off to the adults because somebody would smack you. And I can remember a neighbor smacking me across the head and my mom smacking me when she found out the neighbor smacked me.
It's funny that kind of getting off track here just a little bit. My mother's in assisted living, and I was talking to her yesterday when I was visiting, and I was telling her when my dad knocked me on my butt when I was 16, and she was shocked. She said, Dad did that? I said, well, first of all, back in those days, parents had the right to knock you on your butt if you had bad manners and stuff. And what had happened was I was very angry with my mom and dad those days because I had to work for everything. And they just gave everything to my sister. So I was pissed off half the time. And I was disrespectful to my mom. And I remember being home and my dad walking out there and boom, knocked me down. And the cool thing was he said, Ray, you're right. You have a good argument. You're correct, but you cannot disrespect your mom. And I tell you what, that was the way you learned your lesson. Never had a problem after that. First of all, I was so proud that he acknowledged I had a legitimate argument. But two, no, you can't cross certain lines. And I think we've lost that in our society. I mean, I don't believe in adult abuse of children, not at all. But, back in those days, it was acceptable.
But don't you think that today there is a path to teach people to be tough-minded without being abusive?
Yes. Yes. I agree with that
It's not as easy.
100%.
That's why people don't want to do it.
Well, and not every student, not every human is going to be tough. I mean, that's just the way it is. So you have to teach the student, like you said earlier, to their potential. And there's nothing wrong with that. And that doesn't make that person a weak person. I know some of my students I thought were horribly weak, insecure people that turned out to be some of the strongest people in the world, great leaders. So I know teaching with compassion is the way to go versus the old days, but it is what it is. I was also thinking about the competitions. We have a lot of older guys now that think competition is bad for the art. And surprisingly, these are the guys that competed back in our day. So I'm surprised they have flipped where we have that part of our older group that just hates sport altogether. Where's your position on sport?
I agree with you, Ray. I think it's ridiculous. They don't know martial arts history. When there was the Budo ban at the Meiji Restoration, that's when they started doing the kendo matches with the bamboo
Yeah.
swords because they wanted to keep competition in there. The Budo Kukai was created in the 1800s. Master Osaka, who started Wado, one of the very first things he did, and he got into a conflict with Funakoshi over kumite. And I think I'm going to say the name wrong, but Ben Pollock writes about it in his wonderful history book on Wado, that the college students were all desperately trying to find competition before World War II and after World War II. They were creating competition. It's always been there. Um, I do think that you need, just like we were talking about in the teaching, you need to be judicial about how you put people into competition and make sure that a student has never felt like they have to compete in order to validate your opinion in them. But the truth is, if we're doing a martial art, we do say that it has something to do with the skill to defend yourself. We can't bring somebody into the dojo to endanger your life. But as you know, when you go into a tournament, that's as close as you can come
I agree.
to a confrontation. You get an adrenaline dump. You have to figure out how to deal with that adrenaline. You have to control your emotions. And I've often thought that a good competitor who can keep their head about them would be a good person to have in war. And that's where I think they're wrong about no competition. I just think maybe you're just seeing competition through a bad lens, but I don't think it ruins martial arts. I think it's always been part of martial arts. Think about the Okinawans. They cite the Okinawans saying, oh, well, they don't do it. Okinawans is the one that came up with all that crazy equipment so that they could do full contact.
Well, the thing that's interesting to me is these guys that look down on competition. I don't understand how they can, what's the word I'm looking for? You cannot just train in the school without any stress and learn to fight in a stressful situation. That's just not possible, I don't believe. Do you agree?
I think you're absolutely right. Can you imagine playing on a soccer team, football team, basketball team, and say, we're going to practice, but you're never, ever going to go into a game?
Well, here's
Uh,
another thing too that I found is also competition is geared for youth primarily. There's exceptions to that. And you have to understand too, when you're young, especially younger than 20, I would imagine any of the kids, you're really not into philosophy, and you really don't have a great
no,
appreciation
no,
of
absolutely not.
technique and advanced stuff. You just want to go punch somebody at that time. That's got to be taken in consideration. And then what I've found is people that compete stay kids, and then as they get older, they get out of competition. Then they come back with a love of the art, and they're really into history and philosophy. And you would miss that if you hadn't had them go through that process. Back in our day, I don't know about your schools up in Salt Lake, we didn't have hardly any children. I remember going to tournaments down at St. Mary's and Phoenix. I don't remember even seeing children. I just thought they
No,
were
we
all
didn't.
adults.
Yeah, same in our dojo. In fact, I was looking back on it. I want to say maybe the 80s when they finally started letting kids in the class. And the only reason Sensei Osaka, well, I shouldn't say the only reason, but one motivating factor is he found out that the children's parents would actually pay the dues. Most of his adults didn't pay dues, or
Right.
I mean, they were very sporadic. So suddenly there was an income stream. And since Senpai Joe had no money and Osaka didn't have to pay him, he says, "You teach the kids, you keep the money." And so we had a kids program. Now, Joe was a interesting teacher for kids,
Yeah, I don't see, getting back to Joe,
but yeah,
he
there were no children.
he was really violent. I remember watching him coming up through the color belts because he was already a black belt. A lot of you guys were black belts then. And I was like, oh my God, I get my black belt on. I'm in the tournament and I'm looking at these guys thinking, man, these guys have been black belts longer than I've been training. And I have to fight Crazy Joe. And I'm like, oh my God. And I'm telling you,
Yeah.
from the visual, from the outside, it looked like he destroyed me. But I remember laying on the floor and he's coming down with power punch, but he's stopping him. He wasn't drilling me to death. It looked violent. And I walked away with a different appreciation of Joe. I'm sure he could be violent, but he wasn't violent with me. But everybody thought I
That
got killed.
that was the secret behind that was the secret behind Joe. One time he told me, "You want people to think you're crazy, then they don't bother you as much." And
Yeah.
yeah, you're right. Senpai Joe, and certainly Rick Holbish and people like that, they were seminal people in our training. I mean, their dedication to martial arts and their toughness was pretty phenomenal. And yeah, and Joe was, I mean, a lot of the students, I won't name names, were much more brutal than Joe was. Joe was careful about not hurting you.
The kind of jumping back a little bit, there were some guys up there at Salt Lake that were really, really tough. I'm trying to think of their names. I'm not like you, I can't remember names, but they were hard and tough in the dojo, but couldn't win a match in the tournament. And it taught me a great lesson because just because you can't win a tournament doesn't mean they can't kill you in a real street fight.
Well, I hope he doesn't mind, but Ray Smith comes to mind. That guy,
Yes, Ray
he
Smith.
was so good in the dojo. And I mean, technically good. He could fight good and not as great in the tournament. Day Halling was another one. Uh,
Yes.
Fought real hard in the dojo, but didn't. And I think he was just a little too uptight in the tournaments. But yeah, we had a number of them, and I don't know what it was. I certainly was much better in the dojo than I was in a tournament because I went in with the wrong attitude.
Yeah.
I told you about getting disqualified, and years later, somebody said, "If you go into a tournament expecting a fight, you will find it."
Yes.
And so
Yes.
I didn't realize it was an athletic endeavor. I thought it was like fitness of the, you know, survivalists or something. But yeah, yeah, and they were pretty tough. Like I said, the Malonis twins, those guys were amazing. Mike Warnock, Jim Anderson, Frank Scavo, man, those guys, like I say, they were borderline criminals. And I'll tell you to give you an example of what you're talking about, the toughness. When I got my black belt, Joe came to me and he says, "Now, do you want to learn how to fight?" And I thought, I know how to fight. I'm, I'm a black belt. I've been wrestling in college and that. And he says, "No, no, no. Come and work with me at the Westerner." At that time, the Westerner was a bar over on the west side of town. They could accommodate about 3,000 people on a night, and they always went over. So there were 3 to 4,000 people on Friday and Saturday night. And this was when they were integrating the old time cowboys, the college people wanted to find out about it. So there were fights every single night. They had 12 bouncers. Of the 12, seven of them were from Sensei Osaka's dojo. And I did learn that fighting was altogether different than tournaments or dojo. I think they're related. I think if you get good at one, you can learn how to be good at the other one, but you can't walk in there and say, "Hey, I'm a black belt." I watched a lot of black belts get just the snot beat out of them.
Yes. That's when they come in and they want to learn self-defense. I said, if all you care about is self-defense, just start going to the bar every night. You'll learn how to fight. It ain't going to be pretty like you do in the dojo, but grabbing beer bottles and smash them against people. Yeah, that's exactly right. Well, let's wrap this show up. We're going to, what I want to do, my next guest is going to be my sensei, Marlon Moore. And what I want to do in the future is bring you on and Marlon on and Rick Holbush and just have a round robin discussion about history in general and what you guys know in the martial arts. You guys are phenomenal at mentally remembering things. I can't remember anything. And I hope you would
How
consider
many
being a
times did
part
you
of
get
it.
hit?
Probably too many. That's like my nose, it's not quite straight. And I have many pictures and sometimes it's pointing one way and then pointing the different direction.
I have a
They say,
shoulder, Ray, that I
oh,
can't
that's right.
raise my right arm up.
Yeah, I remember those battles. I really do. Well, with that, we're going to close the show. Thank you. I'm going to
All
bring you
right.
back on again and talk some other areas,
I would
especially
love to. The
teaching.
round robin sounds like it'd be interesting because
Yeah,
memories trigger memories.
it does. It does. And we can organize it and edit it into I think, a nice show that people would really be interested, especially the fanatical martial artists. And it has nothing to do with age. There's some young people I know that are teenagers that would want to know a little bit more about the history of American Japanese karate. What's happened in our United States when the Japanese came in. So we want to keep that. Well, everybody else, thank you for tuning in. I will see you pretty soon with my next guest, Sensei Marlon, my sensei, a man that changed my life. And we're still great friends today. We're one of the few people that are, student sensei relationships that stayed close this whole 50 years. And I'm very excited about that next guest. With that, thank you very much.
Thank you, Ray.
All right, take
Bye bye.
care.